The replication of another generation in the image of the former is no longer possible. The current generation of young will drink but shallow draughts at the fountain of illusion, if they drink at all, for the perceptive of your race have felt the changing climate of the world, and they have realized that in this new climate generational duplication would not perpetuate their societies but terminate them. It is in the interest of every government, democratic or otherwise, to cooperate with the changes of these times and to allow their young people to pursue options and develop capacities beyond those available in societies in which ideas and identities are mass-produced. The stability of a government is not threatened but increased by those of its citizens who become conscious. Ruling interests will not necessarily be dissolved during these decades of transition. However, if they wish to remain solvent through these times and on into the post-historic era, they must recognize and adjust to the intensifying frequencies of love, for institutional solvency now hinges upon the ability to restructure along the vibrational lines of the intensifying energy field of awakening consciousness, in patterns compatible with the many diverse forms that love can take. Not only will this assure their survival, but, more important, it will assist the overall human transition from the fear-dominated historical order to the new order of love-centered creation. Their skill at this and the degree of consciousness with which they participate will determine the level of their prosperity. Though present-day systems of government must evolve further before they fully represent and embody the spirits of their respective peoples, they are nevertheless a vast improvement upon the tyranny and in many cases, the absolute tyranny that preceded them. How easily some forget. How near to you even now are men and women who remember living under the emperors, the czars, the fear dynasties of the early decades of this century. You can be sure that those who remember the times before the old orders were shaken do not wish for their return. The actual and legal protection of basic human rights is still being established in many nations of the world. But a century ago in those same nations such rights were not even conceived of, certainly not among those who governed. What the founders of your present systems have wrought has been imperfect to be sure, but the movements they have initiated are far from complete and their direction is healthy. Wherever our influence extends, the process of democratization continues, the recognition of human equality grows, along with a passion for liberty and a sense of personal involvement in the collective human destiny. Those whom we touch no longer feel that they are passive observers of human events. They realize the transformative power of truth. When it is honored, lived, and articulated sincerely, they become involved. The next 2 decades will see the many sprouts of democracy that have struggled through the spring thaws of these past 2 centuries come into summer flower. These will not be decades without challenge, immune to economic uncertainty or political upheaval, but so it must be, for these are decades of promise and transformation, decades slowly filling. Even now it has begun, with the consciousness of the presence of God. In this growing field of consciousness, harmony is empowered and given authority to stabilize cultural, political, and social revolutions that a short time ago could not have occurred without violence. Along with deeper terrestrial processes and the currents that rule human affairs, world events are gradually being drawn into resonance with the steadily growing field of planetary awareness even before the critical moment when that field itself gels in the cohesive realization of its singularity. The histories of your present nation-states, though they are fraught with intrigue and distorted by the fears of troubled human egos, are histories nevertheless, for those who choose to examine them through the eyes of the spirit, of vastly improving conditions for the peoples of your world. On every continent, the workers of the 1990s are far better off than they were in the 30s or the 50s, to say nothing of conditions a century ago. Spiritually, economically, politically, they enjoy conditions today that yesterday existed only in the minds of their visionaries. Your present world is built on assumptions inconceivable to your ancestors, yet it is good that you do not rest on yesterday's progress, that you seek to move on, to better conditions for yourselves and your children. We support you in this deepening. We encourage you and provide you with the insights required to further build your dreams, for in truth the assumptions upon which the present human world rests need to continue on in the currents of change. But do not deny the gains earned by those who came before you. Your governments, for all their failings, are reflections of the hopes and fears of the people they govern. As your hopes become shared visions and evolve into realizable strategies, your fears will continue to diminish. Your governments will continue their metamorphoses into ever deeper actualizations of democracy and the principles of equality in which it is rooted. The health of a nation's governing structure is directly related to how much it is guided by the great lesson of history. For every violent change, there is an equal and opposite pain, a price paid by victors and vanquished alike. Military power. Until the moment of final awakening, when the field of planetary consciousness gels in cohesive realization, military power will continue to be a necessity for all but a few nations. The purpose of military power is to minimize violence, to ensure that the strong do not prey upon the weak, to use its force, when necessary, to ensure that small ruling elites do not exploit communities, to halt explosions of ethnic violence while simultaneously using statecraft and diplomacy to address and rectify the imbalances that always underlie such explosions. These are valid and, for a short time yet, still essential uses of military power. A military occupation that enforces an unbalanced and inequitable status quo is counterproductive, whereas an occupation that disarms opposing factions while facilitating between them negotiations that address the underlying currents of contention is truly a peacekeeping and, if it does its job well, a temporary force. Whenever a military presence extends over long, there has been a failure to bring contending parties into meaningful negotiation or to allow them sufficient freedom of expression. Governments weak in negotiative intelligence who attempt to compensate militarily for their weakness have been declining since the 1960s. Pacific nations, meanwhile, have been prospering and will continue to prosper as this transition progresses. In an age of information, when new consciousness illumines the ancient corridors of power, and even the darkest places embrace openness and change, the leaders of most nations are realizing that, except in self-defense, violence always proves counterproductive. It is becoming obvious that communication, not confrontation, is the wave of the future and indeed, the new human frontier. Warfare is a form of communication, a primitive signaling strategy used to resolve disagreements usually between peoples who speak different languages or think in incompatible ideological modes. It is expensive and notoriously inefficient. When far less expensive computer-based communication technology can cut through language barriers, instantly identifying the imbalances underlying any dispute and offering multiple scenarios of resolution, there is no longer a need for war, especially given the unacceptable costs of a nuclear conflict. Advanced communication technology can project with frightening accuracy exactly what a given war would achieve, the probable outcome, the cost to society, and approximately how many decades a recovery would require. It can itemize the resources, human and other, that would be irrevocably lost in a projected conflict. When such projections can be made cheaply and accurately, economics alone are enough to retire war as a tool of communication. This may be news to many, but among high-level military personnel this information has been circulating for some time. As a result, the intelligence level of world leaders has been noticeably upgraded in recent years, as has the entire level of international exchange. While popular culture continues to see armed conflict as a viable way of settling differences, warfare is rapidly becoming obsolete, an artifact of pre-informational times. The decline of tyranny and repression. In most cases, those who govern the democratic republics of the world sincerely desire to create a better human community. We do what we can to strengthen and assist the clarification of such motives. Wherever power elites dissolve before the pressures of these changing times, wherever aristocracies or dictatorships are in the process of becoming open market democracies, Wherever entrenched financial interests are losing their ability to control and manipulate disproportionate shares of terrestrial resources, you see people who are being influenced to one degree or another by our energies of awakening. Their activities, though still perhaps tainted with some subconsciousness, are at their cause motivated by the growing awareness of the one whom most of them cannot yet call God. At the beginning of Western civilization, the materializing forces had structured the patterns of fear to restrain, to hold back, to harness as much as possible the approaching field of eternal consciousness. The early breakthroughs of clear thought in the warrior nations of the West were harnessed by the Roman Empire and later by the monolithic feudalism of the Christian monarchs. Our teachings could not remove that restraint, but they could and did modify it. They weakened its hold. Even as the feudal lords of the earth attempted to use truth to further their own ends, truth used them and spread. Despite their attempts to regulate and control it, the first breakthroughs of objective thought were imperfectly translated, practiced, and understood, but enough of their influence seeped through to cause these past 2 millennia to become times of declining influence for fear-ruling elites. Tyrants still appeared, but the duration of their tyrannies came to be measured in months instead of decades, in years instead of hereditary dynasties. And wherever there were those who attempted to manipulate and control the energies of human exchange, their way grew more difficult. Self-righteousness defeats the purpose it presumes to serve. Those who fight what they despise with deception only strengthen its hold, sowing the seeds of further deception, which then have no course but to grow, and appear in yet another decade or generation, presenting yet another opportunity to be seen clearly and resolved. Resolution on the first occasion requires more deliberation in the short term, for it forces the deeper issues up into the awareness of those who may prefer not to see them, yet it is the only path to long-term resolution. Approaches that merely mask the symptoms of inequality are far more destructive than the perpetrators of those approaches generally realize, for beneath their veneers inequality continues to exist, and there, hidden in the darkness, it grows until it surfaces to explode again in yet another and stronger upheaval. The end justifies the means only in the logic of deceit. Wherever evil is chosen in any form, it sows everywhere about it the seeds of its opposing evil. In the end it does not deliver, it consumes. The choice of love may not always seem the swiftest path to the resolution of difference, but it is the only certain one. The October Revolution, the storming of the Bastille, examples abound of instances in which the powerful creative energies that we were introducing into the patterns of existing national structures became exaggerated by those who were the stewards of those energies. The stewards were thrown off balance by a success for which they were not prepared. Often they accomplished the initial purpose of the transformative energies, and then unwittingly provoked the chaos that follows self-righteousness with the precision of a shadow. In the end they inhibited the arrival of the very social equality that they sought and truly desired to create. Those of you who wield the powers of transformation during these times must learn from the excesses of those who have wielded lesser powers before you. Use your powers with humility and with compassion, or you will lose them to those who regard love for enemies in terms more immediate than your own. In cases where the influences of education do not prevail, you will be given the power to remove those who maintain patterns of dominance and exploitation. Do not be afraid of this power. Be decisive in your use of it. But use it always in love, and do not stop halfway. Remove both dictators and the imbalances that allow them to exist. And when you have succeeded, extend to them the same forgiveness that you yourself have already received. Wherever possible, enlist them as helpers, advisors, and co-creative agents in the continued restructuring of the nation. Respect will win them over more surely than corrective measures. Give them the opportunity. Their insight into areas where your own experience is limited may prove vital to you in effecting a smooth transition. Today's intent counts far more than yesterday's failings. In the eyes of God it is all that counts, for in reality it is all there is. Avoid backlash from those whom you have removed from power or from those who once supported them. Welcome all into the light of the dawning order. knowing that a notion of public support provides far more effective social regulation than any amount of legislation or punishment. If the structures of a nation's government are not built upon a broad social base, they do not endure. Sense the skills and talents, the strengths and weaknesses of each one, then let each participate according to his or her ability. This will greatly expand the talent pool available to support your efforts, and stabilization will occur more rapidly because of it. Where you see repentance, sincerity, and the demonstration of genuine goodwill, value it. Use it as wisely as any other resource. Just as the progression of the last 2,000 years has made it increasingly difficult for aristocracies, rich and powerful ruling families, to exploit masses of people, so too, on a subtler level, it is making it ever more difficult for governments to be too far out of tune with the voice and spirit of the people they politically represent. Government derives its sole authority and the legitimacy of its power from the will and spirit of its people. When a government loses rapport with the people it governs, it must change or be changed. It is too unstable to remain. Repression in such cases is as futile as sealing the lid on a pressure cooker while stoking the fire beneath. No matter how many bolts, or troops, attempt to keep the lid on, the very laws of nature rule against it. Repression might delay a nation's movement for a short while, and in an age of electronic media that time is far shorter than it once was. But it cannot prevent it. Repression will only multiply the difficulties associated with realignment when the populist movement inevitably breaks free to release its spent-up desire for change. Yet repression is not always the response of tyrants. Often it is an unconsidered, knee-jerk reaction, not thought through or planned, a reaction that the government involved quickly sees as an error, but which it feels it must nevertheless defend and uphold to preserve credibility and respect. This sort of logic was dubious even when the pharaohs ruled Egypt. In today's electronically altered media culture it is antiquated and self-defeating. Honesty and openness offer the only certain route to credibility. People tire of those who always insist that they are right, while in the present climate of change they generally support those who admit mistakes, make intelligent adjustments, and move on. Where repressive regimes have begun to feel the growing and potentially explosive power of the people they presume to represent, and their leaders seek to avoid the pending explosion, the pressure cooker analogy cautions that it is as unwise to suddenly remove the lid as it was to put it there in the first place. Repressive measures should be removed gradually over a period of weeks or months, with honesty and candor from government leaders, explaining to those affected what they are doing and why. They should begin with immediate changes that demonstrate their sincerity, and then commit themselves to a specific timetable of future changes, securing the agreement of all concerned. Even the worst government provides services that if suddenly abandoned would create hardship. It is important that there be a time of transition. Difficulties are minimized in slower shifts of power. Even then, it may be too late to entirely avoid violence from the extremes. But a once irrepressive government can rest assured that the violence associated with its voluntary dissolution will be much less than the violence that would have occurred had its leaders attempted to retain power. Times of shifting leadership are often volatile. Those associated with the old government share responsibility with those who represent the new to create a smooth transition. To minimize potential violence, it is wise to focus public attention on incoming rather than outgoing leadership. It is always prudent to invest more attention in the future than in the past. Justice can proceed with wisdom. Revenge cannot. Revenge has the ability to divert otherwise creative public sentiment into passions that can easily run out of control. Where power has been relinquished voluntarily, forgiveness, rehabilitation, and education will serve national purposes. If legal proceedings are in order in relation to former leaders, they should certainly not occupy more of the national awareness than the opportunities and possibilities presented by the new order. National psychology. The psychology of a nation can be healthy or unhealthy, much as that of an individual. The study of national psychology has emerged in recent years as the newest and, for now, the most important branch of the social sciences. Many of the same criteria that have been used to evaluate the health of individuals are now being applied to nations. The resulting insights, often revelations, in every sense of the term, are leading to new, enlightened, and far more productive national and international policies. Few outside the intelligence agencies of the industrialized nations are accustomed to thinking of countries as collective entities that can get sick, just as any other life form can. But this sort of thinking has already terminated the Cold War. Its increasing application in the years ahead will revolutionize the field of international diplomacy, much as Einstein's theory of relativity revolutionized the field of physics. During the 1920s, for example, both Germany and Japan had specific national disorders. If these disorders had been properly diagnosed and realistically addressed by the rest of the international community, and if certain reasonable adjustments had been granted by those who controlled what was then the British Empire, World War II would not have taken place. The past cannot be changed, but the present and future are being affected profoundly by this growing awareness. A nation's psychological health is vital to the happiness and prosperity of its people. Leaders and opinion shapers, both in and out of government, have a responsibility to promote policies and perspectives that lead to national health. It is no coincidence that such perspectives reflect the truth. The truth promotes health just as surely as deceit produces disease. The truth is never contained in opposing ideologies. Truth is the reality that overlights all healthy opposition. In the affairs of a nation there is a need for diversity of views and opinions. Healthy views and opinions may diverge 180 degrees on an issue, yet still encourage creative exchange and promote equitable national policy. The spokes of a wheel diverge 180 degrees, yet they are precisely what give the wheel its strength. In order for an eagle to fly, its wings must reach out equally in opposite directions. An eagle with a broken wing, like a totalitarian state, is unhealthy. The new science of national psychology recognizes that in the affairs of a contiguous human community, there are unhealthy views and opinions. Their primary feature, as well as their common denominator, is intolerance. Unhealthy views and opinions do not grant the validity, or even the possible validity, of any other view. They emphasize division. They lead to lopsided, destructive, and often ethnocentric policies that favor elites and diminish freedoms. There can be a broad spectrum of healthy, diverse viewpoints, all contributing to the balanced progress of a nation. And there can be an equally broad spectrum of diseased viewpoints leading only to hatred, violence, and division. Health, or its absence, does not lie in perspectives themselves but in the hearts of those who hold those perspectives. Where alternate views are respectfully exchanged and considered, the nation prospers. Where those very same views are exchanged in anger or in fear, the nation suffers. When a government ceases to tolerate diversity of views, curtails freedom of expression, and censors its media, the people of that nation have a responsibility to either change their government or establish another. This is more than a right, it is a sacred trust. The articulation of vision is the first order of business for any new government. If that vision is to succeed in establishing and maintaining rapport with its people, it must include in its very preamble, in nations where such things are not already established, specific and legally irreversible mechanisms to guarantee the freedom of media, the freedom of elections, the preservation of basic human rights, the assurance of universal legal equality to its citizens regardless of race, sex, religion, nationality, or social, economic, or lifestyle distinction, and last, but equally vital, assurance that all of the people under that government's jurisdiction have equal access to the basic requirements of life. While the communist and the developing nations of the world have more often suffered from governments not sufficiently responsive to their populations, in the United States and in a few other nations, the other extreme has occasionally been experienced. This occurs when a government attempts to please the whims and passing fancies of its people rather than their genuine needs. It is the result of insecure and often inexperienced politicians who lack the courage to act always in accordance with their highest vision. Instead, they allow their decision-making to be determined by what they imagine the people want. A politician is not a leader. Those who are more concerned with elections than with what they believe to be in the best interests of the people they represent lack the vision and integrity that would qualify them as true leaders. A leader always acts according to his or her vision, considering carefully the views and feelings of his or her constituency, sensing the overlighting wholeness of those views, how they converge like the spokes of a wheel in the central hub of balance that is the truth. And then the leader acts upon what he or she genuinely believes to be in the best long-term interests of the society, the environment, and all who may be affected. A leader may appear in the field of politics, as well as in any other field, but a true leader is not controlled by elections or opinion polls. A true leader is attuned to the deeper long-term rhythms that pulse through the collective heart and is inspired and guided by them. He or she is not overly impressed with superficial fluctuations or with those who all too readily fall under their spell. A good leader knows that as the systems of production and exchange of the Earth's nations become increasingly entwined in a single global economy, a vision that remains local, or even national, in scope may yet be myopic in terms of planetary realities. The politico-economic climate of this world has only recently entered the maelstrom of history's final decades. The pace of change will continue to accelerate until the second decade of the 21st century. A good leader will facilitate rather than ignore what is essentially the most fundamental revolution since humankind was distinguished from its mammalian cousins. In a healthy society, economy always follows ecology, and education precedes them both.